2014, closing in on being a decade ago now, but a hashtag people used for a little while still keeps coming up in the news. Gamergate. It's a tag I used probably hundreds of times. You can look up info on it, but huge amounts of information has been scrubbed off of the web, and all there really is to find is a million articles about how gamers got Trump elected. So, maybe don't waste your time. It was a hashtag used by a ton of people for a ton of things. Anyone giving you an overarching narrative of what it is a simpleton, a liar, or just bored of this fucking thing that people won't stop talking about. Why did I, personally, start attaching that tag to my posts? Was it because of how incredibly incestuous games journalism is, and how unbelievably inappropriate the conduct of games journalists is, going as far as having sexual relationships with the people they're supposed to be writing about without undue bias? Nah, I never even actually read Aaron Gajoni's post about his ex and her alleged relationships. As far as the details about that go, it doesn't particularly matter. It's easy enough to see the problems without it. When someone dates or has an intimate connection with the person in the industry they're covering, it creates a mess. It's not just that there's a conflict of interest for you. Now your colleagues aren't writing about someone who works on games. They're writing about their buddy's squeeze in a tight-knit niche so close they even privately planned to get together and buy her gifts. An attack on one becomes an attack on all, and you have to serve yourselves, cover each other's asses, rather than serve your audience or any kind of ideal. Now that I think about it, you could even argue this: someone in the position a writer for, say, Kotaku is in, shouldn't be banging little indie dev girls desperate to make it in the industry, because even if they don't make any sort of explicit deal, their position, one where they could give that dev a favor, creates a power dynamic that makes their sexual advances exploitative and a little rapey. It doesn't have to be sex for favors. It could simply be someone worried that if they say no, they'll be overlooked when it comes to an article on niche games being published on a big site. Just saying. Wonder how many times something like that's happened, given how hard the practice of sleeping with subjects was defended. While all this stuff is really screwed up, it's not what got me involved. On August 28th, 2014, an article written by Lee Alexander called "Gamers Don't Have to Be Your Audience, Gamers Are Over" was published on what was then called Gama Sutra, a games journalism site catering more to those working within the industry than consumers. Following this publication, a number of pieces echoing its points were published on various other sites and blogs. Of gamers waiting for a new release, Alexander said, "They don't know how to dress or behave. Television cameras pan across these listless queues and often catch the expressions of people who don't quite know why they themselves are standing there. Games culture is a petri dish of people who know so little about how human social interaction works." She described how, early in gaming, suddenly a generation of lonely basement kids had marketers whispering in their ears. The following day, on the same website, a piece by Devin Wilson was published, in which he argued that if our medium is designed for people to stay secluded for dozens of hours while having their egos stroked, then we reap what we sow in terms of the kinds of people who emerge from this pastime. And so on. Over a dozen pieces were published with the same gist, that, quoting Dan Golding, "Video games have now achieved a purchase on popular culture that is only possible without gamers." Supposedly, these pieces were about fighting hate, about defending women from conservative crusaders upset that games weren't serving their ideology. At the time, I couldn't help but notice, however, that whenever they directly described these so-called gamers whose identity must be obliterated and no longer associated with gaming, that they were painting an obscene caricature of people with autism. hyper-focus on one special interest, difficulty with social situations, behavior that seems odd, especially when around other people, introverted and secluded in their pursuit of a special interest. And that's all from the tiny snippets I just read. As someone diagnosed with high-functioning autism, parts of my personality I struggled with in my teens were being viciously, repeatedly attacked, despite absolutely not being involved with any of the behavior they were blaming these traits for causing. Contrary to their claims of inclusion, these writers clearly wanted those who found gaming to be a refuge that suited their unusual style, struggles, and introversion to go away, because it was ruining their dreams of being social media rock stars. Gamers weren't cool enough to be associated with and put under the same label as these great new media intellectuals. Or in short, these articles were cope. People don't think they're losers because they're losers, it's the gamers and their shameful social awkwardness. These brilliant writers were just being painted with the same brush. This is what planted in me the seed of what I've become. Normal, non-writer people were ants they could look at through a magnifying glass and play with. But if you for 1 second treated them in the same way they treat you, it's a travesty. You're attacking women, even when, of course, you're criticizing men in a male-dominated field. If they degrade you and your kind to an audience of thousands, that's fine. If mere hundreds talk back to them individually, having read what they published to thousands, that's a harassment campaign, controlled by the dark web, that needs to be stopped by force. Conspiracy theories are fine when they do it. They're the media. It's truth. So I posted a video to Twitter, calling for the lens to be flipped and for them to be stared back at twice as hard. This is about when I learned that these people are malicious rather than careless. I did a lot of extremely boring work for a YouTube channel. Some of you will have seen its fruit, finding conflicts of interest. Journalists, including the original Gamers Are Over author herself, clearly being close friends with subjects of their writing undisclosed. Things like staying at their places or going out drinking, discussing the good old days when they did XYZ thing together, traveling together or whatever. A handful of intimate relationships even. All posted publicly by the authors themselves, but semi-hidden, just out of the way on services like Google Buzz or on old blog sites. Why did I do all this? Nothing better to do than screw with these scummy, holier-than-thou hypocrites, practice making videos, and maybe make some change to standards while I was at it. The few responses I ever got from writers, though, included a claim that I was motivated by my hatred of Native Americans. Yeah, I don't know either. The really funny thing is, these guys might be right that gamer culture influenced the 2016 election. Generations of gamers grew up reading games outlets with piss-poor standards, from the classic corporate corruption of appeasing advertisers to the more modern indie clique issues. Can you blame gamers for ignoring reporting or doing the opposite of what writers demand when games journalists trained them throughout their childhood to believe news can't be trusted? This is what I mean. They'll look at games and tell you all the ills in the world they cause on a grand scale. They'll tell you what's wrong with gamers. But the second you look at them and what they throw out into the world, well, doing that's abuse, harassment campaign, cyber terrorism, misogyny. Zero responsibility taken. Ever. It was a clown show. I can't emphasize enough that those couple years were utter madness. We had stuff like a BioWare dev calling something that happened on this hashtag the Night of the Long Knives writ large. I don't know, man. Hitler wrote that shit pretty large to begin with. Brianna Wu, maker of one of the worst games I've ever played that I think has stolen music at one point, had a show made about the Navy SEALs copy pasta being sent to her. I'm not joking. This is real. It had a sniper in a house across from hers talking about having over 300 confirmed kills. A Microsoft Paint drawing of Super Mario with his cock out was called a rape threat at some point. Insanity. 24/7. And there was so much more. I personally loved when some male journalists got chewed out and swarmed for talking about being harassed because it took away from the idea that women were being targeted. The characterization you see now that this hashtag was some sort of cyber holocaust for gamer girls tightly controlled by a handful of dudes in IRC together is hilarious. So, over time, I realized there's too much trash. It can't be fixed. Smashing what you can is all there is to do. I decided that rather than point at flaws in hopes of improvement or understanding that was never coming, I would become a cultural brawler and take on the mantle of harmful opinions. Kind of a cringe name, right? Why'd I pick it? Was I being an edgelord? Is it ironic? No. During the Gamergate days before I was radicalized by games journalists, I actually engaged in quite a lot of autism advocacy, as I mentioned. This was mostly either ignored or used as a tool by others. It resonated with a few people, but that's more or less it. Except John Bain, also known as Total Biscuit, when brought onto an online show to discuss Gamergate, made sure to bring up the point that these careless, soulless, heartless critics were catching people with social struggles in their ego-fueled missions crossfire. He said it with clear sincerity and without being pressured. Then one day, I read an attack on him. It was written by a guy called David Gallant, a dev of various garbage games. In it, he wrote that TB had been, quote, exhibiting harmful opinions. I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard, so of course it had to be my name. A reference to a commentator I respected, and a constant reminder of the ridiculousness of internet discourse. So, thanks again Gamergate fam, and rest in peace, Cynical Brit.